Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activists, Learn Languages, Make a Difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Yebra Lopez, and today I want to tackle a very tricky question. What are we doing when we use two or more languages during a single conversation? Now, the answer might seem simple. We are just switching between different languages, switching between French and German, switching between Swahili and Japanese, etc. The reality, however, is much more complex. Although it seems that we are just switching between languages, this, I will argue, is just an illusion. And by the way, a very dangerous one. Stay tuned. So what are we doing when we speak different languages in a conversation? There are two main paradigms to make sense of this. Now, the first paradigm is code switching. This is the hegemonic paradigm, so much so that is the common sense of our time. We still think that when we use, say, French and German within a conversation, we are just switching between language codes, switching between the language code of French and then the language code of German, respectively. The second paradigm is translanguaging, which implies a much more fluid functioning of our linguistic reality. Now let's begin with the perspective of code switching. This is by far the prevailing perspective in today's society. Now, according to code switching, language as an abstraction can be objectified into discrete, autonomous, self-contained entities we call languages, such as Swahili, German, etc. Now, the notion of code switching supports the idea that what a polyglot is doing during a conversation is switching between different language codes from one, say for instance German, to another one, say for instance French. Moreover, this split between languages is built into our biology and into our brain matter. So according to code switching, our brains discern between separate language entities. This paradigm, however, is problematic on many accounts. Now, the main problem with code switching is that it takes an outsider's perspective. So you start with the idea that languages are discrete, separate, autonomous entities, and then you map that separation onto what's going on in the real world, say what's going on in a conversation where people use German, French, Italian, etc. However, this begs the question of what is the nature of languages? Do languages simply exist? Who gets to decide what counts as a language and what doesn't? And so, contrary to what code switching assumes, languages are not mental or psychological entities. Instead, they are socio-political constructs. The coinage of languages does not happen in a vacuum. Instead, it is the end result of long political histories of economic and social disputes, etc., etc. So think, for instance, of Spanish. Has it always existed as a language? Is it a language that exists in nature? Is it a mental and psychological object? Well, of course not. Spanish at the beginning was just a vulgar Latin sociolect that was then successfully, and by the way, forcefully, reconceptualized as worthy of literary tradition and therefore as worthy of being called a language proper. First Castilla, with the publication of the first Castilian grammar by Elio Antonio de Nebrija in 1492, and then Spanish. Now, this process ran parallel to and was shaped by a dynamic of conquest and colonization, first within the Iberian Peninsula and then outside of it. The enthronization of Spanish has taken place and continues to take place, by the way, at the expense of the repression of other linguistic varieties as unworthy of a similar literary prestige and tradition, including, for instance, the repression of Catalan, Galician, and Euskera, notably under the Francoist dictatorship, but also the pejoration of others such as Chabacano or Ladino, also known as Judeo-Spanish. So when we use code switching, we are assuming that languages exist by default and already in nature. And in doing so, we are validating the ideologies and the political processes and the violence behind the coinage of every single language as such. That is what makes the idea of code switching deeply problematic, is the fact that it relies on the existence of languages as discrete, separate, autonomous, self-contained entities, and that in turn presupposes a whole process of dehistorization and depoliticization of the way in which linguistic varieties actually come to be named. It also presupposes, rather than proving, that that separation between languages is intrinsic to our nature, is intrinsic to the way our brain functions. But this is not necessarily the case. The problem at any rate here is that we are starting from ideas and ideological premises and then mapping those onto reality, rather than starting with reality, with the facts themselves, and then work our way up to a better understanding of that process. This is exactly what translanguaging puts forward. So according to translanguaging, rather than switching between codes, rather than code switching, what speakers are doing in a conversation is working from a unified set of linguistic features, also known as linguistic repertoire or ideolect. And it only looks as though they're switching between codes from an outside perspective, provided that that perspective reproduces the ideology that languages exist in nature, which is just a naturalization, a dehistorization, a depoliticization of the fact that languages are always already named after the fact. They do not exist in nature. They are not mental or psychological entities. They are socio-political constructs that normally have behind the interest of a nation state or other political agents in whose best interest is for that language to exist. Hence why, as you can read in this wonderful article entitled Clarifying Translanguaging and Deconstructing Named Languages, a Perspective from Linguistics, written by Ricardo Otegui, Ofelia Garcia, and Wallace Reid, here's a key quote. It says, translanguaging is the deployment of a speaker's full linguistic repertoire without regard for watchful adherence to the socially and politically defined boundaries of named, because all languages are named after the fact, they do not exist in nature, usually national and state languages. And at this point, I want you to understand that this is not some philosophical abstract discussion. This has profound and important repercussions in both education and politics. For instance, schools are premised on the idea that languages are these autonomous, separate, self-contained entities. Departments are organized this way. Courses are organized in this fashion too. And students are punished whenever they are code switching. So if you're in a French class and you're there using words that are thought to be part of the self-contained box called English or Spanish, you are likely to have points deducted from your exams, from your grade in participation, etc., etc. But we need to understand here that just as languages do not exist in nature, the same applies to schools. So from a Foucauldian perspective, from the perspective of Michel Foucault, we can better understand now that schools are instantiations of the state, so that if it is in the best interest of a certain nation state to enforce the supposed existence in nature of a given language, such as English, German, Spanish, etc., it follows that it will be in the best interest of the school to reproduce that ideology. And that's what schools do. They reproduce the idea that languages exist as self-contained realities in nature. And this has been shown in many studies that compare how children think about languages prior to school and how they come to think about languages as discrete and separate entities after school. So whereas before school, a child that lives in a multilingual household tends to think of his or her interactions with his or her parents in terms of different situations where he or she needs to work from different aspects of his or her linguistic repertoire. When that person makes the transition to school is going to be indoctrinated in the idea that he or she was not just using different linguistic features in different situations. He or she was using this self-contained entity called English and this autonomous reality called Spanish, and that these two cannot be mixed unless that student wants to fail his or her Spanish, English, French, etc. class. So I hope I've given you a clear summary of what the main differences are between code switching and translanguaging. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. You also have in the description of this video a number of sources that will allow you to deepen your knowledge on this issue. And as always, thanks for watching.